Okay. Thank you for the very kind introduction, and I look forward to our conversation and to the larger conversation. I love the title that's been given to this talk, Freedom as a Habit, because I think it helps us take a step towards what freedom must be. It must have to do with people, and it must have to do with the way we act, and it must have to do with things that we learned yesterday that we're applying today. Or to make the point a different way, what is freedom not? What is not freedom? And what do we mistakenly think freedom is? I think what we think freedom is a kind of algorithm. I think the dominant idea of freedom today is the notion that freedom means freedom from. So I am free if I'm not oppressed. And of course, sometimes oppression is very real and must be removed. But to think of freedom as negative, as freedom from, can at most be the first step towards freedom. You can take a person out of a concentration camp, but they won't be free until they've been fed, until they've been treated, until something like a normal life has been restored. When towns and villages in Ukraine are deoccupied, to use the Ukrainian word, that's not the same thing as being liberated. You can remove the concentration camps, you can remove the torture chambers, you can stop the executions, but people aren't free until the rubble is cleared, the roads work again, the buses are running. Freedom has to be positive, not negative. If we think of it as just negative, if we stop there, we end up with tremendous political and moral problems. If we think that freedom is just negative, which is what most people in Europe and America say, we end up saying freedom is against the government. And so what do? We make the government smaller, we make the government dysfunctional, and then suddenly the conditions for freedom, those roads, those buses, those trains, those schools, are no longer there, and we're all less free. Or, if we think that freedom is just negative, it's me against the government, if that's our only thought, then very quickly, our idea of freedom becomes me against my neighbor, me against other people, me against the migrants. And the deep underlying problem here, the deep moral problem here, is the algorithmic character of this thinking. Me and it, inside and outside, us against them. That is an algorithm, and it's a very comfortable algorithm. It's very elegant and therefore very attractive. The idea that I'm free because I can reject something else is simple and it's appealing. But its very appeal is really quite dangerous, because if freedom is just about me against other things, I never have to ask who I am or what I stand for. I never have to ask. Freedom in that sense is always irresponsible. I'm always locating the enemy somewhere else. I'm never asking what the good is. So to put it a different way, if we treat freedom as negative, we're always working against the evil without ever defining the good. And at the end of the day, you can't work against evil without defining the good. At the end of the day, if you don't define the good, what is evil is simply a matter of convenience and impulse, and you'll be very easily manipulated. But when I say that negative freedom is an algorithm, I actually mean this quite literally. It reduces our behavior to a very simple political pattern. Let's have less government. Let's make the government smaller. There's a simple answer to everything. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the spread of the internet, the spread of social media, has made this kind of thinking much more popular and powerful. The people who believe that freedom is just about making government smaller, are far more powerful in our world now than they were before social media. And I think that's not a coincidence. I think social media actually trains us to think the world is about me and the others, us and them, and freedom is just a matter of impulse. In other words, I think the actual algorithms that run social media have turned us into more algorithmic creatures, more isolated, more alone, more inclined to this simplistic way of defining freedom, which is fundamentally wrong. So what would be right then? I like this word habit, and I'm going to work from the introduction and from the figures who were mentioned in the introduction. Václav Havel, who was one of the thinkers mentioned, talked about our most improbable states and our most probable states. Writing in the 1970s, he was already very concerned about a world which would be more mechanized, in which we would be more predictable, in which we would be predictified, in which we would be made predictable by our interactions. And Havel had the insight, which I think is very profound, that the heart of freedom is unpredictability. It's not being part of the algorithm. It's not being captured by the algorithm. It's not being capturable by the algorithm. But the only way for that to be true is for our freedom to be positive in a moral sense. And Havel thought this too, that to be free wasn't just a matter of staying out of prison or resisting oppression. Being free involves caring about things. And this was Havel's great conviction, that freedom was not about a huge struggle against the great evil, that freedom was about things like rock and roll music, or good beer being better than bad beer. Those are the actual examples from his political life and his most important political writings. That freedom is about the things that you actually care about. Not the things you pretend to care about, not the things that everybody around you cares about, but the things that you actually value. And that might be integrity and beauty and grace. It might be rock and roll. It might be good beer. But the things that you actually care about, your values, are what make you free. Because the combination of those values is not only unique to you, it's also unpredictable in a way that the world outside is not. And here Havel was on to something which Leszek Kolakowski, Isaiah Berlin also pointed out. It is our values that are the source of our unpredictability. If we were just like physical objects, then we would be predictable like other physical objects. But if we are instead, as Edith Stein said, if we are instead a Leiber, if we are a special kind of body and not just a Körper, a physical object, if we are the kind of body that can bring values in and then back out into the world, that makes us unpredictable, and it also makes the world unpredictable, or more predictable than it would be otherwise. The thing is that the values that we care about don't fit together like physical objects do. They have a different math, a different physics. If I say that wall is longer than this wall, I'm just describing reality. But if I say honesty is bigger than loyalty, I'm saying something absurd. You can't compare moral values. They're incommensurate. You can't reduce them one to the other. They're just out there. And as we go through life, we make choices among them unpredictably, creating unpredictability in the world that wasn't there before. Simone Weil is the one who talked about habitude, or habit. And she had in mind something I think very important about freedom, which is that it has to do with limits. That seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? If you're in a world of negative freedom, a Silicon Valley libertarian world, for example, or a Hollywood world, you're told everything is possible. And this is going to be the revelation of this lecture. everything is not possible. And the people who tell you everything is possible are one day away from telling you that nothing is possible. Negative freedom says you can do anything so long as we knock down this wall, knock down this government, right? Then anything is possible. But that's in fact not true. We have limits. And when we know these limits, we become free. So the Silicon Valley aspiration, for example, to live forever, which is rather a common thing, is not liberating at all. The people who believe that they're going to live forever, you probably don't have as many of these people in Catalan as we do in California, but if you believe you're going to live forever, you have to live in a bubble. You have to be afraid of everything, right? It's the fact that we know that we're going to die, which in fact makes us free, and that's a limitation, a very fundamental one. They was saying, and it's a very touching example because of course she came to Spain to fight, right? But then she couldn't, partly because of her own physical clumsiness. What Simone Weil said is that the very things that are limitations are our capabilities. So there's gravity that pulls us down. But without gravity, we can't walk or dance or play sports, which was her example, which she got from Hegel, and Hegel got it from the Greeks. The things that seem to be limitations are the things that we work with in order to become free. And Weil correctly said, in my view, we are only free to do the things we know how to do. Right? It's a very simple thing, but freedom involves what our bodies can learn how to do, what our minds can learn how to do. And then finally, the third thinker, who was mentioned in the introduction, Edith Stein, had something very important to say about habits. It has to do with the habit of empathy. Again, if you're in the negative freedom world, if you think freedom is just about me, just about you, then other people don't figure very much. Other people tend to figure, if anything, as barriers. So if I'm in a negative freedom mode, then the government is a barrier, but you are also a barrier. You're a barrier to my freedom. What else could you be? And in that mode, it's very easy to switch from libertarianism to fascism, by the way. It's one of the many ways that people switch from libertarianism to fascism, because you say, well, freedom is about me and my liberation, and you are all just constraints to my freedom, as far as I know. What Edith Stein said is profoundly helpful in confronting that. Stein points out that we don't really know ourselves very well. And again, if you look at the people who are currently running the United States, this might be one observation you might make about them, that they are not incredibly self-aware. Another interesting observation, by the way, is that they're very unhappy. The people who have all of this wealth and power, all they can do when they get on stage is complain. They can't smile. They're unhappy. What Stein pointed out, and which I think is profoundly true, is that you cannot be free without empathy. It's easy to say, you're just a problem for me. But if I say that, I don't really ever know who I am. And on any account of freedom, you can't be free unless you know yourself. And here's the thing. You can't know yourself without other people. It's literally impossible. We all walk through life with giant bits of metaphysical shaving cream on our faces, or giant bits of metaphysical spinach between our teeth. We don't know this unless someone tells us. There are very basic things about yourself that you will simply never learn by yourself. You can only learn them from someone you trust, from someone who you believe is another human being, which is what Stein meant by empathy. Empathy didn't mean being nice. It meant the fundamental recognition that the other person is also a person. And the way Stein came to this idea was as a nurse during the First World War, when she was treating the wrecked bodies of soldiers. And it was there that she, seeing these men, different gender, different sex, in a very different position from hers, that it was there that she recognized, I see these people as people because we're both bodies. So Stein helps us to see that we need other people to know ourselves, and that means we need other people to be free. What comes from this is a different kind of politics of freedom. So again, if you take a negative notion of freedom, it's pretty easy to end up where Russia is today or where America is today. If you start in the Soviet Union in 1991 and you say all you have to do is free the economy and privatize everything and let the market work its magic, you will end up with something like what you have in Russia today, which is a fascist oligarchy. If you take the kinds of ideas that thrive in the United States, where freedom is just individual heroism destroying the government, you'll be in January or February 2025, and there are your heroes of negative freedom trying to destroy your government, leaving everybody less free. But if you think of freedom as positive in the sense of empathy, if you think of it as positive in the sense of habits, and if you think of it as positive philosophically, then you end up with a very different kind of politics, which says, in order to be free, or in order to have free individuals, you have to have a certain kind of set of societal institutions. If I'm seriously empathetic about what other human beings go through, then I start thinking about freedom from childbirth. I start thinking about freedom from the moments that matter the most, and I create institutions around childbirth so that young people can grow up with the conditions in which they might become free. And from that basic insight, which has to do with bodily empathy towards the woman and the child, which has to do with the recognition that the child will become free by way of habits the child develops, and which has to do with the recognition that those habits are moral habits too, that in order to become free, we have to learn how to juggle all these values. From thinking about freedom in that way, you very quickly generate a politics which involves parental leave, vacations, public schools. In other words, you very quickly generate a politics which is popular on the left, but which is justified in completely different terms, in terms of freedom, which is, I believe, how it should be. I believe the welfare state is fundamentally about freedom, but it's not justified that way. And you also end up seeing how this version of freedom, the negative version of freedom, the one which says it's me against the world, me against the government, that this might be something, but it's not actually freedom, right? So you end up with a concept which brings certain things together and which clarifies and deepens, and I think justifies a very different and a better kind of politics. So I wanted to be loyal to the title and loyal to the introduction and talk about these thinkers, and I'm very happy to have been able to have a moment to talk about freedom as a habit, because I think that is fundamentally what it is. It's not the end of a Hollywood movie where one person triumphs over all odds. It's not a matter of one heroic person striking down the government. It's not a matter of ignoring everybody else around you. It's a matter of creating the conditions politically so that individuals can grow up in a way where we all might be free. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Snyder. Those conditions regarding to your book starts with childbirth, and the state, the government should provide for healthcare and education. How neglected have been those two areas of our society in the US and Europe?
Well, I mean, let me start with the premise, because I think it's really important. One of the methods of the book is to try to look at extreme situations and treat them as the source of common sense, like what the Germans sometimes call Grenzerfahrungen. The Germans have a word for everything. I'm sure you do in Catalan as well. But the Germans always have a word for everything. And this idea of a border experience, like an experience where you're at the edge of life or death. And think of those things as normal. So when, like, in Ukraine, seeing people who were held in the basement of a school for the entire Russian occupation, then the Russians are driven out, but are the people free then, right? I mean, it's better that the Russians are gone. The Russians were killing them. More than 20 people were killed. And when the Russians were driven out, then the whole village, this is a place called Yahidne, the whole village was in this basement. And when they came out, that was, of course, better. But they weren't free. They weren't free. When I visited that village, afterwards, they were asking me for help in building a playground. And so a war's going on, or the Russians are killing and torturing and executing. Terrible things are happening. And they were asking about a playground. And that's so illuminating because it tells you what people really care about, right? Their children had just been held as prisoners in the basement of the school. They couldn't use the school as a school. There was a playground in front of the school, but they couldn't use that. They had to go somewhere else. And to be free, those children needed a playground. They needed other things too, but they needed a playground. Just coming out of the basement, not dead, was not the same thing as freedom. And that's an extreme situation, but it's very clarifying, I think. And and it's clarifying in the direction of positive freedom, obviously. The whole idea of liberation, which is a word I try not to use, even though I think I just used it, I think the whole idea of liberation is essentially very misleading, right down to and including phrases like liberation of Auschwitz. In the time and place, it was very clear to the doctors and nurses who arrived at the concentration camps that it was not a liberation because people needed care. And if you listen to the testimonies of Holocaust survivors decades later, you can see there's still a great deal of care that is needed. And if you start from that extreme situation, then you recognize, well, that's always true, in fact. Like, even if we haven't survived a murderous occupation or a concentration camp, it is always true that we need more than just the removal of the bad things. It's always true. It's true for all of us all the time. And so at one end, there are those kinds of extremes. And then there's the other kind of extreme, like the one which is the beginning of life, which of course I can only talk about to a limited degree, right? I'm a witness at most of the beginning of life. But if you start from the moment where the baby is born, then you recognize it becomes, your intuitions change. You see, well, if this child that I can hold in my palm is going to be free, so many things have to happen, right? And the child can't do them himself. Negative freedom makes no sense to a baby. You can't say to a baby, I am now going to remove all of the government regulations, and then you're going to be free, right? You realize that, like, in the nature of human life, like in the basic nature of human life, that child needs so many things: shelter and food and nourishment and company and companionship and games and playfulness and language, which can only be provided by other people. And those people, in our modern world, for people to provide that, they then need a certain kind of politics. They need a politics where there's childcare and where there's schools and where there's parental leave, right? And it's that basic reality overthrows the false common sense of negative freedom, I think. So I'm dwelling on that because I can't talk about these things in Spain or Catalonia, right? I can only talk about them in the US empirically. But what I can say is that I think the way we think about freedom negatively affects the way that we treat childbirth. And then that makes childbirth the beginning of less free lives. I mean, in a very literal sense. So, I mean, I'm going to tell you all these things because, you're all going to read the book anyway. And this is all in the book. So it's not like I'm sharing something that I haven't already shared with, a million people. But when our first child was born in Vienna, Austrian law requires you to stay in the hospital for 96 hours. And that is incredibly liberating because at the end of it, you know how to breastfeed, you know how to bathe the child, right? And you have the beginning of something. Whereas in the United States, where our second child was born, they don't let you come into the hospital until like the very last minute. I'm trying not to be too, okay. They make you wait until the very last minute, and then they push you out as quickly as possible. And so there's no chance that you're going to like learn to breastfeed or learn to wash the baby. You're just in and out, and you're in and out because of the money. And so it's when I go to hospitals in America for other reasons, like I see these women like being pushed out with their newborn, and they're still the women are literally still in a wheelchair. Like the women can't even stand up, and they're holding the newborn, and they're being pushed out the door. And that's how life begins for that infant. And like that beginning is so unpromising, but it fits perfectly with negative freedom. And so it's like, so I thank you for the question, because I think it's like, I can't like go into a deep comparative discussion. I can only say that negative freedom affects how we think about healthcare, and in particular childbirth, and it starts life off in this very strange way.
Let me introduce another subject. I would like to talk about fear. We live in fear. Maybe we always have lived in fear. Humankind, since the beginning, modern politics starts with fear to death, and relying on a leader to save us from death and from fear. I think that today populists also they dare of dying. No, they want to live forever. We have Donald Trump as very young, and also Vladimir Putin's. So there's this cult to youthness. This fear, we are bombarded every day. This poly-crisis, the mass media. How can we combat this fear to fearness? How can we get liberated from fear?
So let me first try to connect that question to the point I was trying to make about algorithms in the beginning. So in a binary situation, you only have two choices, and therefore you're incredibly predictable. If a politician can get you into a situation where there are only two possible things you can do, he's got a good chance of knowing what you're going to do. And fear is a binary situation. When you're afraid, you're either going to fight, or you're going to run away, or seek comfort, which is the same thing as running away. And so politics, authoritarian politics anyway, is designed around engineered fear. It's designed to make you predictable. And by the way, the algorithms on the internet work very much the same way. They're designed to dose you with pleasure, 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 fear, pleasure, fear, pleasure, pleasure, fear, so that you're trained up to become an animal, which is always in fight or flight mode. That's the way they work. And that's the kind of creatures they produce. And that's the beginning. And so I say that because fear is so essential to this topic. If I can get you to be afraid, then it's very hard for you to be free. And if you become addicted to fear, or if you think fear is normal, or fear is the only way to function in society, it's very hard for you to be free. And just to be clear about this, if you're in fight or flight, then you're not in that moral world, which makes you unpredictable. If you're in fight or flight, you're not thinking about integrity or mercy or beauty, or you're not in the world that makes you unpredictable. You're in the world that makes you predictable. And so much about freedom is about getting over the line from predictability to unpredictability, which very often means over the line from fear and fearful reactions into something else. And of course, the relationship between how much we're afraid and what there is to be afraid of is almost entirely arbitrary. I mean, of course, some of us have very specific things that it's reasonable to be afraid of, and I understand that. But how fearful we are at a given moment is almost entirely disconnected from how fearful we should be. and it's very largely, as you say, generated by structures. And so how do we get around this? I mean, the first part is to recognize this, which is what the book in a way is about. Like you're not in fact free if you're a prisoner of your impulses. And the people who are trying to lock you into your impulses, whether that's by way of a screen or whether by way of rhetoric, are trying to make you unfree, and they know what they're doing. And the second part, we already talked about in a different way, which is that if I can make the world around you more predictable, then you have a chance to be more unpredictable, right? If the world is very unpredictable, if there are bullets flying, you're going to be predictable, you're going to be afraid. But if there aren't bullets flying, if there are good roads, good schools, there's health insurance, if those things are laid down for you, then you have a chance to learn to play the violin. You have a chance to learn to ice skate. You have a chance to try out good beer and bad beer. You have a chance to become a person who has an unpredictable collection of attachments and virtues, right? But that depends on this thing that we call, very unglamorously, we call the welfare state. It's a very unglamorous name for a very liberating thing. And then the third part of it is already suggested. The third part of it has to do with the screens. If we're going to be less fearful, we have to spend less time on the screens and more time with other people. The screens are basically designed to make you anxious and afraid, and they make your body more subject to fear. They make your body more submissive. And on the other side, all the time that you spend on the screen is time you're not spending with other human beings. And when with your other human beings doing something, you're less fearful. And this is true also when there are things to be afraid of. If you're in a dramatic political situation, you'll generally be more fearful watching it on TV or on the internet than you will be out doing something.
So nothing is as bad as it seems. We are misled to think that things are worse than they really are. Maybe objectivity is a subject you write about on your book, but we tell lies to ourselves in order to survive. We can get rid of that, and can we approach the screens with the sense that they are telling the truth? How can we turn around the communication infrastructure to make it more valuable for society as a truth source, completely trustable?
So much of what I'm trying to argue in the book comes from the very simple premise that freedom is about people. And that, when I say it, it probably seems almost childishly simple, but in fact, so much of the way that we talk about freedom has been located somewhere else, away from people. We've lost control of the word, and therefore the concept. And let me try to give a couple examples. One would be the everyday phrase, which you've probably heard quite a lot, the free market. Like when I say free market, you don't react. I mean, maybe if you're, a good leftist, you do. But when I say free market, you don't immediately react and say, well, that's absurd. But it is. The free market is an absurdity. There is no such thing as a free market. There never has been, and there can't be, because if you don't have the state defining the rules, you can't have a market. The people who talk about free markets are very enthusiastic about property rights. Property rights are a government intervention. You can't have property rights without the government. And once you have government intervention, then it's just a question of how much. There is no such thing as a free market. It's logically impossible. And yet it somehow, as an idea, as a meme, it functions very well in our languages. And the way that it functions is to take our freedom away. If you talk about a free market, you're not talking about free people. And in my view, we should only ever put the adjective free in front of people. I will give you possible aliens and maybe octopuses, but in general, I can tell some of you have read the book about the octopuses and most of you haven't. But in general, we are the only kinds of creatures who should be called free. because we are the only ones who are in this predicament of life and death and bodily limits and capacities with the ability to make moral combinations. Us, that's it. And so we should keep the word free. When we give it away, it's not just that we are demeaning ourselves, it's also that we are submitting. So when you say free market, what are you saying? You're saying the market is free, and therefore I have duties to the market. I am not allowed to intervene in the market. That would be very bad, because the market is free, right? That's what happens when you lose the word. Something related has happened with free speech. So I'm going to stick to my guns, and I'm going to say there is no such thing as free speech. There are free people speaking, but there's no such thing as free speech. And this is not just an academic, eccentric distinction. If you say there's free speech, what you were saying is that the freedom actually belongs to the machines. 99.999999, lots of nines, of the utterances in our world are not directly made by people. They are they are repetitions generated, thrown out at you by way of machines, by algorithms. The huge majority of expression is not directly from a human. And so if I say free speech, what ends up happening is we have debates about algorithms on the internet, which is what we do. And in those debates, it very quickly becomes about the free speech of the owner of the social media platform. So I don't know, it's a little bit different in Spain and Europe, but in my country, our debates about free speech are generally about is the most wealthy and most powerful person in the world, is his free speech being somehow suppressed? That's what it's about. And that is, as soon as you give up the word free and put it in front of speech, that's where you're going to go. That's where you're going to end up. And that's where we have ended up. So you have to think about freedom as beginning with the human, and that seems simple, but it actually takes a little thought about what that would mean. It would mean that in this world, this digital world, the freedom that we care about, the only freedom we care about, is the freedom of expression of a human being. We don't care about the machines. They don't matter. They don't live, they don't die, they don't care. We're very generous, we care about them. but they don't live, they don't die, they don't care. We shouldn't care about them. We should care about us, which means that freedom of speech would mean, first of all, everybody should feel safe expressing themselves. Second of all, it would mean we need to be creating conditions in which people grow up, are raised in such a way that they have something to say, which means precisely getting the screens out of the classroom and out of their lives as much as possible. And we have to create the conditions in which there are things they can learn, which means we have to support journalism. Because despite what we think, the internet doesn't actually create facts. It takes an ever smaller set of facts and spreads it ever more thinly. The only way to get fresh facts is to send humans out into the world as scientists or journalists or in some other form to discover those facts and communicate them in a human way to other humans. So I've tried to work my way towards my answer to your question about what we would do in this digital world. I mean, more practically, tax the social media platforms, treat them like polluters, understand that they're doing positive mental damage, tax them accordingly, regulate them accordingly, use the taxes to fund local journalism, to fund education, and so on and so forth. But don't allow the quote-unquote free speech argument to work, because it simply doesn't apply to them. Freedom of speech actually demands that you regulate them, tax them, and create conditions for human beings.
Yeah, I think that maybe we can also need to treat information as we treat food, to regulate how it's produced and how it's consumed, rating what is healthy for our brains and hearts in the information we consume.
I mean, I'll make a very simpler point. I think we have to believe in truth. I think we have to believe in truth. That's where you have to start. The moment and this would be more of a like critique of the left, where the notion that people are liberated by becoming purely subjective, I think, has turned out to be not true. If you think that freedom is just about freedom from facts, I think you're falling into a negative freedom trap. If you think that freedom is just about, a pure interior set of opinions and commitments, then I think you're in a negative freedom trap, because you're saying freedom means I'm free from your opinion, I'm free from the facts of the world. I think that turns out not to be liberated, or I should say I think it has turned out not to be liberated, because that essentially left-wing perspective on liberation is obviously then taken over by the people with the power and the money, and then you have your deep-seated feelings, and they have their deep-seated feelings plus a social media platform. And in that situation, you lose. You lose. Your feelings turn out not to matter, because that turns out not to be the kind of truth you can share with other people. Whereas factuality is. Facts are. So we have different values, and like in that sense, of course, we have our own truths. I'm not trying to deny that. It's very important to freedom. But the thing which allows us to work together are the facts that we share. And if we say the truth is only what I think the truth is, then we don't have facts that we can share, and we end up isolated and alone and dominated by the people who very consciously use this notion that there's no truth and no facts to control, right? Because if there's no truth, then it's just who has the best technology or the best ability to spread their falsehoods who wins, and then you end up where you are now. So I would start with that. Like I would start with, in order to be free, we have to, it sounds incredibly naive, right? Like, do people ever get up on stage and say, I believe in truth? But I think and if it feels weird. It feels weird. I'm not going to make you all say it, don't worry. Like, this isn't some kind of but it would feel a little weird to say I believe in truth, I think, for many people. But I think without that, you can't get to the kind of discussion you want to have, because how can we label information without having some kind of, gradient, some kind of criteria?
No, I was saying that because it seems that the big lie is winning. And the big lie has been a tool for ultra-conservative in the US to gain power, and now they're using this power to dismantle the state as far as we know it. You predicted that Donald Trump was going to stage a coup d'etat before January 6, 2021. And during lunch, you said more or less that you don't have a confidence that he will go home after his term ends in 4 years' time. In your book, you write about the end of the United States as we know it. What's your prediction for this second term of Donald Trump?
So first of all, when you make predictions that are true, it puts you in a very awkward position. So I have actually predicted a number of things correctly, which I don't want to sound immodest, but that's pretty much unique in public life. and it's quite weird, because if you make incorrect predictions every day, it doesn't hurt you at all. I mean, at least not in my country. Maybe here it does, but in my country, you get up in front of the television cameras, you get it wrong. You get it wrong every day. And then you come out the next day and you get it wrong that day too. It doesn't matter. Like, predicting things wrong doesn't seem to matter. Whereas if you predict a few things and you're right, like I predicted Russia would invade Ukraine, I predicted that Trump would try a coup, I'm then a little bit careful, because I don't want to be wrong. I want to I have these few precious things I got right. So I did basically say if Trump wins, they're going to try to dismantle democracy. That was a sort of prediction. And amazingly, not every American understood that. I mean, to me, that was just obvious. The man has never cared about democracy. He ran his whole campaign on grievance. He's somebody who tried a first coup d'etat, and if there are any rules about coup d'etat, it's that if at first you don't succeed, try again, right? I mean, there are two things that happen after a failed coup d'etat. Either they lock you away, or they execute you, or you try again. Those are the two things. And so Trump's in the try again stage. We're in the try again stage. And he's got smarter allies this time than he did last time around. So that's happening. I don't know, there are other things you could be thinking about, but as we speak, Elon Musk's minions are penetrating the American federal government and trying to take it over directly, digitally, actually. Not legally, but by taking control of the information systems. That's happening today. So I don't want to predict beyond that. What I would want to say is that one of the reasons I care about this freedom business is that I think that meaningful resistance is only possible in the name of something. And other people can have other ideas, and maybe they're right and I'm wrong. But for me, I think that positive idea is freedom. Freedom reopens the future. Like, freedom endorses cooperation. Freedom allows all the other values inside of it. So I didn't write the book for this reason. I wrote the book because I wanted to get it right. But I think you can't really do resistance over the long term without some positive idea. And that was a problem Americans had, honestly, the last time around, that people had a vague sense that something was wrong, but what we were doing was defending. And you can't defend forever. You can defend for a while, but after a while you have to have an answer to the question, what are you defending? And then an answer to the question, well, if you win, what are you going to do, right? And so in American politics and American public life, we were so often in this position of the people who wanted to destroy the status quo against the people who wanted to preserve the status quo. And in that conversation, in the end, there's actually no room for freedom, because freedom has to be about the future, new things, like some prospect of change. And so we needed to break out of that, and I'm trying to contribute with the book. So I don't know, because there are lots of ways that Musk and Trump can be resisted still. They really can be resisted. The law is not on their side. There are a lot of good state-level politicians. There are a lot of things that Americans can still do. I don't know if they will. It's like, I'm being Gramscian about this. Like, it's still going on. I can't say, because it kind of depends on what we do. If people go for, I will say this, if people go for 3 months without recognizing that this is an existential threat to a rule of law system, then obviously we're going to lose.
Well, we have the confidence of the judiciary system as a containing wall, no, for all the politics Trump tries to implement, no?
It's funny, right? Because, I mean, that's America. Like, that's what we do. We sue each other. That is our thing. It's like, the French or the Spanish, like, they go to the streets. We sue each other. That is our basic form of politics. And it's, so what Musk and Trump have done in the first 2 weeks or whatever it is now, they've broken hundreds of laws already. They've broken a lot of laws, and their strategy is, we're going to break so many laws so fast that people will stop thinking that the law is a real thing. That's what they're trying to do. I'm not so sure that's going to work, though. Like, it's already failed in a couple of cases. Because what we do, it's not so much that we pass laws. You might have, if you've been following American politics, we haven't actually passed a lot of laws lately. And Republicans in particular, they don't pass laws at all. So, like, we can have this whole Trump 4 years or 6 or 8 or 13. So long as the Republicans have a majority, the interesting thing is, I don't think they're going to pass any laws. That's an interesting kind of limitation they have, because A, they don't know how to, B, it takes a lot of time and work, Their thing is much more, we're against stuff. And so when they have a majority, this because they're in favor of negative freedom. So you give them a majority in Congress, and what they do is they stand around and do nothing. They don't pass laws. And this is a statistical matter. If you don't believe me, go back and look and how many laws the Republicans passed in the last couple of years. So a funny thing about this present situation is, they have the Congress, they have the Supreme Court, they have the presidency, they have a majority. So in a European setting, if you had a majority in Parliament, you'd be getting out there and passing laws. That's what you would do. I don't think they're going to do that. I think what they're trying to do is have these executive orders, but the executive orders, in fact, is only the president saying, enforce this law, enforce that law. Otherwise, it's illegal. So Trump signs hundreds of executive orders, some of which are illegal, some of which are partially illegal, some of which are legal, even if we don't like it. And his hope is that he'll get away with some of it. And then the other part is, they have Musk and Musk's 19-year-old interns running around the federal government, stealing everybody's data, and so they can prepare to blackmail all of us by saying, we're not going to send you your Social Security checks unless you do what we say, or unless you like jump up in the air and say Elon Musk is God 3 times, or who knows what they're going to want you to do. But I think like lawsuits can stop a lot of it, and I think what we're going to see in the next few days is, like there were 100 executive orders, there will now be like 1,000 lawsuits. Because we are, I don't mean to brag, but we're really good at that. Like, we are really good at that. You give our lawyers like 3 days, they'll produce an 800-page complaint. And I think like by Wednesday, there are going to be a lot of 800-page complaints about the things that are happening. So we'll see. So the reason that, of course, we were laughing about the rule of law is the Supreme Court is a particular, like, we have this kind of, Olympian Supreme Court where they wear robes and, and there's no check on them, and they kind of define themselves as gods. And most of them think the Constitution means whatever they say it means. And they're in an interesting position now because they have obviously enabled Trump in a lot of different ways. Without them, Trump never comes to power, because we had 4 years of trying to prosecute him in like this terrible slow motion thing where we failed to prosecute him on, he was found guilty for 35 or so felonies. But we failed to prosecute him on a lot of things he should have been prosecuted on. So, for example, all this, right? He took boxes and boxes of he stole boxes and boxes of classified documents and then like left them in his house. And then when foreign dignitaries came to visit him, he said, "Hey, look, here are the nuclear secrets. Isn't that cool? And look, this is about submarines." It's kind of interesting, right? That's clearly a crime, but we somehow, and he tried to steal the election, which was also clearly a crime, and we didn't manage to prosecute him. Part of the reason for that was that the Supreme Court found various ways to slow stuff down. And eventually they gave him, they invented this thing called presidential immunity, where he can't commit a crime if he's doing something that's somehow related to his office. So they've cleared the way for him. Without them, he never would be president. But and this is where it gets interesting, okay? Because I think most of them are cynical jokers who don't care about the law at all. But if they let him go too far, then they become irrelevant. And so I think, and at some point they're going to realize that. So that's where things start to get interesting. Because if they let Musk and Trump go too far, then, and we don't have a rule of law state, then suddenly they're just like 5 guys. I say 5 guys consciously. Suddenly they're 5 guys just like wearing ridiculous outfits. And that's it. Like suddenly they just look silly. Like from one day to the next, they go from being demigods telling us what law is to just being people who, wear the same thing every day, and it's kind of a weird thing that they wear.
Are you afraid or worried for your freedom as a U.S. citizen, professor, an academic?
You mean academic freedom in particular, or?
But yourself, to be able to pursue your professional career, to talk freely, to have the audience you have today in the U.S.?
I mean, it's a nice question. I don't seem to have the ability not to say the things I think. And so I'm not worried. If you mean, do I think bad things will happen to me? The honest answer is there are so many people in America who are so much more vulnerable than me that by the time they get to me, it would already be a very different world, right?
You're one of the main outspoken critics of the Trump administration. You call them fascist all the time. Not only him,
I feel like all the time may be an overstatement.
Okay.
Sorry, but yeah, well, okay. No, the answer is no. The answer is no. I mean, I don't feel like I have the right to be afraid. And my answer was serious. Like, yeah, I might be better known to you than a bunch of women of color in my country, but it's the women of color who are going to get targeted and who are going to get the death threats. I mean, I get death threats, but it's like this, and like how many death threats you get is totally sociologically predictable based on gender and race. And so, I mean, things happen that I'm not crazy about, but no matter how prominent I am, I'm also not the most vulnerable. We can put it that way. Many other people are much more vulnerable. But it's an attitude thing too, because they're doing terrible things. They're doing really awful things, but they're also trying to create this sense that they're unstoppable. And they're not unstoppable. I mean, they're taking a lot of drugs, and they're very energetic. But that's not the same thing as unstoppable. And
so we should take the same drugs as themselves.
no, yeah, ketamine is actually no. You shouldn't all take ketamine. That is not the message that I have been conveying at all in my very earnest discussions of like corporeality in the human body. I was not saying everybody go home and take ketamine. On the contrary, being half serious now, I would suggest that the negative freedom view of the world, where you don't take your body seriously and where you think nothing's impossible, does kind of logically take you to ketamine bars.
And last question about Europe. Do you see hope in Europe? We have welfare, which is a way for freedom, but we are stuck between the US and Russia. We have the Ukrainian war and also the Israeli-Palestinian war, which I think also is quite an European war. How do you see the role Europe is going to be taking in the next future?
Yeah, I mean, someone asked me earlier whether the questions were the same. Like, I've written this book about freedom, and so I go from country to country, and do people ask me the same questions? And the thing is, like, with both Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, every country is quite different. You know, the conversation in Norway is actually quite different from the conversation in Sweden, and both are quite different from Germany on both of those questions. And so, you know, Europe is an assemblage of a bunch of things. I don't mean to dodge the question. I just find it interesting, and in a way, good, because, you know, the Germans can't be right about everything, right? And they're certainly not right about Israel-Palestine. And they're not right about Ukraine either, for that matter. So I'm going to answer it a different way, a bit like I answered it when we talked about this at lunch. I think it's really important not for Europeans to assume, to take for granted, that in 2025 you're going to have a big role. You might not play it, but you might choose not to play it, but you have a big role because of the reason you're giving. Like, Trump and Putin don't mean that you don't have a role. Trump and Putin mean that you do have a role. And one has to get over this European habit of saying, like, Russia and America are so big and we're trapped between. You know, your economy, I mean, give Trump about 5 or 6 weeks and your economy will be bigger than ours, right? You know, the Russian economy is roughly the Belgium and the Netherlands together, roughly Italy. You're not a small actor. I mean, you're diverse, but you're not a small actor. You're a big actor. You're a much bigger actor than Russia. And you're diverse, but you're going to be much more coherent than we are. I mean, Trump's foreign policy so far is find your best friends, treat them as badly as you can, and thereby allow your enemies to prosper. That's it so far. I mean, what we're doing to Canada and to the Danes over Greenland is just so, it's morally just disgusting. It's morally disgusting. Those countries have been, you know, I'll say better allies than we have deserved and make the Americans mad. But it's true. Like, they have been faithful allies. throughout the entire Cold War and in decades after it, and they've done all kinds of things for us. And to treat them as like the enemies coming out of the gate is just disgusting, but it's also strategically insane. Because you can't, if you want to be powerful and get your interests realized in the world, you have to have good friends. You can't alienate everybody, and you can't invade and just, you think we might have learned from other wars, but you can't just invade every country and then make it the kind of country you want. That's not how war works. So the point, though, is that you're going to be more sound and sane than we are in 2025. And the trap that you're not allowed to fall into is the normal European trap where you say, okay, the Americans are doing something, let's have a lot of commentating about it, and now let's wait for them to do the next thing. And then let's talk about how bad that was. And then let's anticipate the next bad thing. And that is what, a lot of European media is already doing that, and it's something you really have to avoid. Because, of course, Trump will keep serving you up the latest outrage. But just being outraged at an American isn't enough to be a European. You have to actually do something. And the obvious place is Ukraine. And so maybe this will be the last thing. But there could be an opening with Ukraine. And the opening would be that Trump and Putin achieve a ceasefire, which I think is about all they can possibly achieve, because Trump does not, I'm trying to be as kind and fair about this as I can. He doesn't really have the attention span for peace talks in the normal sense. Right, like if you try to imagine him, at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, with like what would that be like, right? He'd walk in, he'd be like, these desserts are no good, and then he'd walk out again, and then, he's not a Talleyrand, he can't focus for that long. And he also doesn't care about the world in that way. Because, he doesn't care about American interests. And so in order to engage in foreign policy, you have to care about your own country, which he doesn't at all. He cares, it's not a secret really anymore, but he does care about winning the Nobel Peace Prize. He cares about that. He wants to die in clean sheets in the White House with that thing on his neck. That's what Trump wants. But he thinks he can get the Nobel Peace Prize just by making a deal. All right, putting that aside, Putin, on the other hand, wants to continue the war in Ukraine until it's over in the sense he wants, namely he's dominating Ukraine. And so he will see a ceasefire as, I will give Donald Trump the thing he wants. Donald Trump, you are a big, strong man. Look at you. Together we have achieved peace. Now you go off home and get the Nobel Peace Prize. You've been a very good, strong man, Donald Trump. And then divert the Europeans by saying, well, look, there's you don't have to do anything for Ukraine. Look, there's a ceasefire. And meanwhile, as soon as everybody's attention has been diverted, he will then just invade again. And then you'll feel very hopeless and guilty. So the opening that there might be is the opening where there's not a peace treaty, like there wasn't in South Korea, like there wasn't in West Germany. It's pretty normal to have a big war and not have a peace treaty. So the opening would be there's not a peace treaty, so there are no limits on what you can do, but there is a ceasefire. And in that moment, Ukraine has to join the European Union right away. European investors have to come in big time. European soldiers have to come in as peacekeepers. You basically have to flood Ukraine with everything you've got in your own interest. At this point, I would like for you to care about Ukraine, but it is very much in your own interest to make that a prosperous, secure space so that there is not another war. If you don't, there will be another war. The ceasefire between Trump and Putin is not going to save you from that other war. The only thing that saves you from the other war is building up Ukraine so that in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, when Putin's attention turns back to Ukraine, he looks at it and says, okay, maybe this isn't worth it after all. And then he does something else. So the ceasefire, if there is a ceasefire, that is where Europeans jump in. That is your historical opportunity. That is where you act like we did after 1945. And you can't wait for us because we won't do it. I mean, we're about to abolish USAID. We're not going to be doing this reconstruction in Ukraine. The most you'll get out of us is the ceasefire. And then when you get the ceasefire, then you move. And you can do it. Like that you can do. You have the resources, you have the experience, you have the companies that want to invest. You could do all of that yourself.
Yeah, listening to you and reading your book is, we should be grateful to be Europeans and to learn how much have we overcome. Your book is full of European thinkers and not American ones, which I think is rewarding for us. Thank you, Professor Snyder. I want to open the floor to some questions now. Is this somebody? Hola. Y aquí al...
Thank you for the talk. I just want to ask about freedom outside, trying to persuade people about freedom for people who don't necessarily think they want it. Yeah. For example, we might say Putin is incredibly popular according to polls in Russia. You might also bring that into Trump won the popular vote. It's not an aberration, this situation. And related to that, what is freedom of speech in a world where you have basically varying types of people who think, some for example, are Elon Musk, who has one type of freedom of speech, everyone else has another type of freedom of speech, but there's no sort of truth in it, if that's the right way of phrasing it. There's no objective truth, perhaps.
So, I'll start with the second question. I was trying to get at that with the whole algorithm habit business I started with, and then our conversation about factuality and believing in truth. You can't do this without actually analyzing what is meant by freedom of speech. You can't do it because if Musk says free speech means I control the world's information infrastructure, then what happens is people either agree or they just give up on the concept, which is what's happening. Like, so you have a lot of people who think, yeah, Musk is a free speech hero because he suppresses Twitter accounts, which he does. The algorithms are completely ridiculous on Twitter. So you have to have an account of freedom of speech of the sort I think that I was trying to build up, namely that it belongs to humans. And the thing is that argument I think is kind of unassailable. There is really no reason to care about the algorithms. It's obviously the case that freedom of speech is there to protect the vulnerable, not to aggrandize the powerful. And so you have to make an argument about what freedom of speech is. That's part of it. And you have to believe your argument is right. They've kind of conquered that space just by repeating over and over again that what they do is free speech, but it isn't. And you can't do this without regulation, as we've talked about. And with truth, historically, the reason why we have freedom of speech has to do with three things. It has to do with the physical vulnerability of human beings, the reality of truth, and the political reliability that the strong will punish the weak. That's why we have freedom of speech. The reason why we have freedom of speech is that if someone in a weaker position speaks the truth to someone in a stronger position, they might suffer. And what I'm saying is uncontroversial. We've forgotten this in the last 5 minutes or 5 years or whatever, but what I'm saying is historically completely uncontroversial. That is why you have freedom of speech, because if someone says the truth, they could be hurt, and therefore we have this thing called freedom of speech. It's meant to protect their body, essentially, from the person about whom or to whom they're speaking truth. And so if you keep in mind like those basic features, that it's about a human body, it's about truth, and it's about a power imbalance, then you're making a case for freedom of speech which involves everybody, and it ennobles everybody's attempt to try to get around the powerful. And it means that like someone like Elon Musk will, of course, he'll have freedom of speech like everybody else, but he's quite literally, or either he or Putin, of the 7 billion people on the planet, they're the last two you have to be concerned about if you think about freedom of speech in the right way, because they're the most powerful. You start with the least powerful, the bodies that are most threatened, and you work your way to the most powerful. So of course, they have freedom of speech, but they're the ones we need to worry about the absolute least. And the fact that we worry about them the most is a sign that we've got everything backwards, right? There was another question in there somewhere. Oh, yeah, no, look, that's the whole point, my friend. I mean, freedom is hard. It's not like, if I could say like, hey, freedom, and it would be like, yeah, freedom. That's not it. Like, I mean, that's America, by the way. Like I say, hey, freedom, and then you say freedom, yay. And you hold up a sign. You hold up a sign that looks just like everybody else's sign, and it says freedom. I say that as somebody who has literally done that. But the freedom is hard, that's the point. It's hard. If it weren't hard, then this conversation wouldn't be worth having. It's not the natural condition of people. It's, historically speaking, it's very unusual. You have to struggle for it. Like the things that, it's beautiful that we can care about things, but for us to be able to care about things in a reliable, long-term way, we have to be free. And that's hard. And you're right, people don't necessarily want it. I think they want it more than they reveal in public opinion polls in Russia, though. I think like that sort of controlled environment is not, if you take those same Russians and you put them in Belgium and ask them the same questions, you'll probably get a different answer.
Tengo una pregunta ya.
Thank you for the very thoughtful lecture. My question goes back to the beginning of your statement, where you spoke on people, whether they be individuals, groups, countries, that have suffered tremendous violation of their liberties. And you spoke that you not only have to take the bad away, but you have to introduce the good, whether that good be, part of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basics, but also what is very important to them and what they self-define. It surprised me that that list did not include some sense of accountability. Because for people who have suffered greatly, whether it be war, genocide, concentration camps, imprisonment, if those who have violated their liberty get away with complete impunity and there's no accountability of any kind, can they ever truly be free?
That's a really interesting question. I think it may be at a slightly higher level than what that I've been talking about, because I'm trying to start from the ground up. I do think that whether or not Russia is held accountable, to take the example I was using, there is still a profound gain in freedom when a village is liberated and the trains are running again. I think it's true that many of those Ukrainians, and some of them are here, they can tell us, but many Ukrainians would then think Russia has to be held accountable. But I don't have much trouble imagining a Ukraine which joins the European Union and where Ukrainians can study in European universities, where Ukraine is prosperous and Ukrainian refugees go back, where Ukrainians would say, you know what, actually this is now, we're getting back to something which is free, even though Russia will not be held accountable. I mean, you have to imagine, it's a pretty demanding counterfactual. I'm not kind of turning this around on you a little bit, but like, it's a very demanding counterfactual that Russia will be held accountable. And so are we really then going to say Ukrainians can't be free until Russia is held accountable? The vast majority of Nazi criminals the vast majority were not held accountable. I think it is possible, though, that some of the victims or people associated with the victims did end up in some condition which you might consider to be free. So I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it, but I think that may be a higher level consideration where, in order to pursue justice, you do have to be free, or something like that, or that the moral calculus that you're talking about is only possible when you are free. That might be where I'm leaning in my answer to your question, but I think I'll just leave it at that.
We have one more question there, and then we go more.
Thank you for pointing out that freedom is not a natural condition, because we are Ukrainians. Sorry, I'm a bit social phobic. Because we are Ukrainians know that it's a choice and some actions are needed towards that. And my question is another. Could you please point out the key zones of the interest for the US to achieve a ceasefire? What is the deal behind? Thank you.
We talk about you. There we go. I so much more want to talk about your remark than answer your question. I will answer your question, but I want to talk about your remark because it's really important. There's like a historical narrative of negative freedom which says capitalism is going to bring democracy, or capitalism is going to bring freedom. And in that kind of technological or economic determinism, humans don't really matter. We don't have to make choices, right? There's this thing called the free market. It just does everything automatically for us, and then we're free. And that's not just that's wrong, it's an essentially authoritarian way of seeing the world. And it has led to authoritarianism, in my view. The idea that there were no alternatives, that capitalism brings democracy or freedom, trained people to think that history was on their side and that freedom and democracy were not a matter of human action. And they have to be a matter of human action because they're not automatic, going back to the previous question. And it's not just that as a matter of fact, they're not automatic. By their nature, they're metaphysical. I mean, freedom is not like soil erosion. It's not like rainfall. It exists partly in a metaphysical zone. You have to commit to things that are not visible but which are good in order to be a free person. And the same is true for democracy, by the way. There's not any historical force that pushes strongly towards democracy. It's a really hard thing to do, to say we are the people and we want to rule. It's historically quite strange. You have to believe in something to make that happen. And so the premise that as you put it is very strong, and it's very important. And it's one of the things that we've really gotten wrong. I mean, and the war in Ukraine was, for me personally, as I experienced the beginning of the war in Ukraine, I thought a lot about this problem of negative freedom. Because when the war began, I was in February 2022, I was in the US. And I was, going back to why I don't want to be wrong by making more predictions, but in February 2022, like everybody in America said, if there's a war, Ukraine will fall. And the time period people used was 3 days. So we were just like the Kremlin. I mean, we had the exact same set of predictions. They'll fall in 3 days, and Zelensky will run. And I said Zelensky won't run, and they will resist. I didn't know how long it was going to last, but in saying Zelensky won't run and they'll resist, I was in this like tiny minority of people who were basically laughed at. And then, and of course, we can talk about why Ukrainians stayed, but for me as an American, the troubling thing was, why was it so clear to us that they wouldn't fight? And what really, and because of course it didn't say anything about Ukrainians. Most Americans don't know anything about Ukrainians. It doesn't really have to do with our level of knowledge about Ukrainians. It has to do with how we think the world works. And if you're in this negative freedom story about how capitalism brings freedom, and so all you have to do is knock down some barriers and so on, then you've trained yourself to believe that freedom is brought from the outside. And if you train yourself to think that freedom is brought from the outside, what happens when it turns out that it isn't? You run. You run. Because you've never learned that it's about you. And so Americans who talk about freedom all the time, when they're confronted with the situation of apparently overwhelming military force, they, in my view, project it onto Ukrainians, and this is where, like, you know, some Americans get annoyed with me. But they projected onto Ukrainians, I think, their own reaction, which is, okay, freedom is brought by history or capitalism, but then when it doesn't, it's not. What do? You have to run. What else would you do? And that was really troubling. And I write about this a little bit in the book, but it shows, I think, how we misunderstood things. And it was really puzzling for Americans at the beginning that Ukrainians were resisting. And then after a while, it became inspirational for a lot of people, and that was good. As for I'm sorry, I can't say much about the actual question, because what you need up here, and there are such people, you need like an optimistic internationalist conservative Republican, and they will I'll tell you what they'll tell you. They'll say, Trump doesn't want to be bullied. He'll realize that Putin is bullying him. They'll say, Trump doesn't want another Afghanistan. He doesn't want to be embarrassed by losing. And they'll say, Trump will understand with time that in order to get to a ceasefire or even a treaty, he has to weaken Russia and strengthen Ukraine. That Trump will understand that with time. That's what they would say. I would love it if that were true. I mean, what I think is that Trump doesn't care about American interests, and so you can't really start the argument with. I don't think he has a notion of American interest. I don't think he actually has a sense of like what raison d'etat, would mean, because I just don't think his imagination contains categories like the state or, I'm not saying he's stupid. Just to be clear, he's very smart and very talented and very charismatic, and it really doesn't pay to underestimate him. I'm just saying that he doesn't live mentally in a world where there are states and nations. He lives mentally in a world where there are various like competing strongmen and hustlers, and like a lot of like strongmen and hustlers, he wants to be recognized at the end of his life as a good person. And so like if he had money, he could build a museum, but he doesn't have the patience, he doesn't have the money. But what he can do is win the Nobel Peace Prize. And honestly, I think that is so this is me talking instead of the imaginary, optimistic conservative. I think your only hope really is that he wants the Peace Prize, and so people have to explain to him that you're not going to get the Peace Prize if you just cut a deal with Putin and 3 weeks later the Russians are in Kiev, right? That's not going to get you the Peace Prize. And in order to get the Peace Prize, you have to come to some arrangement where there's actually peace. And no, he's going to have to, this is your job. He's not going to listen to me. This is like, I'm going to leave this to the European diplomats. But I think that's the only window, that like he wants to be seen as achieving something. And in order to achieve it, he has to strengthen Ukraine and weaken Russia. He hasn't figured that out yet, but he might. And then you get to the next step where if you want to weaken Russia and strengthen Ukraine, you need policy instruments. And I mean, again, I wish I were that happy, like conservative, but I have to just say what my observation has been, which is that they don't really do policy instruments. Their way of doing policy is to tweet angrily and to undo things that other people have done. So even things like sanctions, like sanctions are actually a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to do sanctions. You have to really care to do sanctions. And I just have trouble imagining the Trump people sitting down and figuring out how sanctions work and what they need to sanction and all that stuff. So, I mean, that's how I feel about this. I really think this has to be the year of the Europeans for Ukraine for various reasons. I think in the best case, we're going to be completely absorbed with ourselves for the next 6 months. And, we gave you enough. The Biden people, is it too early for Biden revisionism? I mean, but the Biden people did in fact do quite a lot for Ukraine in the last few months. And the result is that the Ukrainian army can fight for a while. And while the Ukrainian army can fight, we're going to have to see a pivot of the Europeans to do a lot more. Because even if there is a ceasefire, which in my view is the best thing Trump could do, even if there is, that just means the Europeans are going to have to be in there doing the real work.
Well, thank you, Professor Snyder. We don't have time for any more questions, I'm sorry. To summarize, I think we have homework to do as Europeans, first regarding our own freedom to work on it, and then regarding, of course, Ukraine and the war there. Yes. If you want more of Professor Snyder, you can follow him to Madrid, where he's going to be talking tomorrow at the Fundación El Pino, and he's going to be signing some books there on the table on the right. Thank you.